Hey, Ross.
Hey, Spencer, how are you?
I'm doing really well. How's everything with you?
I'm great. It's Friday, which is one of my favorite days of the week, so that's good right there. And I'm sitting in my office. Where are you?
I am broadcasting or dialoguing from my housemate Matt Iglesias' room. I have no idea how to set up Bluetooth on my phone. Matt and I labored at this for quite some time, and then we decided to go from his phone. And we're in his room because I have no furniture. So there was nothing even to balance the device that I'm coming to you through.
Wow, why do you have no furniture? Is that a lifestyle choice?
No, that's more of an accident of circumstance that gets into a whole long and sordid story of how Iglesias and I came to live together. I intend for there to be furniture later on, but since that's probably not too interesting to people out there, I wanted to say it's fortuitous that Ross, we ended up dive-vlogging together, because I found myself this weekend up in your old stomping grounds of Cambridge, visiting some friends of mine at the bastion of privilege that resulted in your best-selling and groundbreaking first book. Harvard University. Indeed, yeah. And while I was up there, it had occurred to me, given the outcome of the most recent election, that for the first time in my life, that I find myself along I grew up in New York City, between the Boston-Washington corridor, particularly standing in Harvard Square, I might in fact be in the new heartland of America.
This is the first time in your life that's happened? So you were never at Harvard at like age 12 or 13 or something, back in the brief, glorious moment when Clinton was president and Rostenkowski wasn't in jail yet and Tom Foley was Speaker of the House?
Sadly, I missed those glory days.
Yeah,
I was
too
busy on my own juvenile pursuits.
Well, hopefully people will look back on these 2 years between now and 2008 as a similar brief hiccup in the long conservative march to total dominance, and people will say, "Oh, hey, remember when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House, and what's that guy's name? Hooyer, whatever his name is."
Right.
So do you want to talk about the leadership elections, which
yes, because it was so strange to me to see when I was at Harvard, thinking that there might in fact be this moment of liberal resurgence. Insane to me. The Red Sox were picking up Daisuke Matsusaka. It seemed like everything was firing on full cylinder for the heart of the liberal establishment. So it only seemed to return to form that in her first move out of the gate, Nancy Pelosi could do something, so characteristically stupid and short-sighted and parochial as to side with Jack Murphy. It was like a security blanket for me, Ross.
A reminder of why you became a liberal in the first place. It's for the incompetence.
For the incompetence, for the inability, as the cliche goes, to take one's own side in the argument, for the short-sightedness, one can say. I think that sums it up. I'm curious in your thoughts as a conservative, after what might have been what I can only imagine was a rather distressing election, after your recent habit of growing ever more excited about every other November, what you observed from this recent round of House leadership debacle.
On our side, of course, we just, having gone down to an enormous midterm defeat, the Republicans just re-elected exactly the same leadership team in the House, and then in the Senate they decided that the thing that they needed, a party in search of an image makeover turns naturally to Trent Lott. I
think all eyes on, in these moments of crisis turn naturally to Trent Lott.
I think we all do.
We want to know, will his porch get rebuilt, and will Bush have a drink on it, non-alcoholic drink?
Well, but see, after in a way, the Democrats' leadership election got, it got all the press as being the epic disaster and so on, and Pelosi For those of our viewers who aren't following this closely, Nancy Pelosi backed Jack Murtha for the number 2 spot, and campaigned for him actively, as I understand, tried to twist arms, tried to throw her weight around, in her new role, and failed miserably. And with the result that, this looks bad for the Democrats generally, it makes Pelosi look like a weak leader and so on. But the long-run outcome is that, Pelosi, who everyone knew was going to be Speaker of the House, is still Speaker of the House, and Steny Hoyer, who, I don't know what you think of him, Spencer, but, he's not a terrible face for the Democratic Party. He's a, center-left, moderate figure and so on. My impression is that this does some short-term damage to the Democrats, and certainly short-term damage to Nancy Pelosi's ability to cast herself as a firm leader. But ultimately, it's not a terrible outcome for the Democrats by any stretch of the imagination, and it's the Republicans who probably have more of a problem because their leadership hasn't, they lost an election, but their leadership hasn't changed at all except to add Trent Lott.
Well, just a quick word on Hoyer. Before the New Republic, I think the polite term is fired me, we had, or they had...
Parted ways.
Before we parted ways, I believe last spring, Steny Hoyer came for an off-the-record lunch, and because it was off the record, I can't talk about what was said in there, but my impression of him...
Oh, come on, Spencer, they fired you. Spill it. Dish the dirt.
No, we can... No. I can't. I'm not in the habit of burning non-Scooter Libby related sources. What we can say is that Hoyer struck me as someone whose entire political persona is based upon this mode of establishmentarianism that the left right now finds incredibly unappealing, and I'm not sure it's unappealing to them as a posture so much as it is as an attitude. There's certainly nothing about Hoyer's political life that I think we can say can be determinative of any position he'll take, aside from just what's most immediately seen as the consensus and establishment position. So if you've got, from this perspective, Nancy Pelosi, the wild-eyed California liberal, it'll serve the Democratic image rather well, especially if the press is going to talk about a split in the Democratic ranks, to have the establishmentarian, business-friendly Steny Hoyer as her number 2. Turning to Murtha just struck me as an absolute overstretch. Here's this guy who's basically not distinguished himself on many issues outside of the rather routine aspect of defense appropriation, which granted is very important, but doesn't do much to establish a public profile for you. I remember in 2002 he wrote a book called From Vietnam to 9/11 on the front lines of national security, and you can find it in a remainder bin near you, provided that you live on the Potomac. And now, he comes out against the Iraq War and he becomes this liberal hero. And putting Murtha, who doesn't really seem to have any leadership skills, in the majority leader slot seems like a pretty foolish choice. But everyone will forget about this after Thanksgiving. In fact, I'm going to bet that everyone's going to forget this after the Ohio State-Michigan game. But my question for you, Ross, is, given that the House leadership didn't change over, to what extent should we view that as the House and the Republican Party more generally not ascribing its failures to the House leadership? Do they see this as the wages of Bush in the Iraq War? Do they see this as more deep-seated problems for the party, or do some Republicans view this as in fact a failure of Hastert and Boehner?
Well, I think one thing to remember is that the House leadership did change over very recently, and so there's probably a sense
how could we forget
among House Republicans that it's not fair to punish the new leadership for mistakes that basically flowed from the Hastert delay era, and so it's probably only fair to give them a chance.
Is that your position?
Well, my position. No, that's not my position exactly. I'm not sure exactly what my position is. I know what it's not. It's not the position that you get from a lot of people on the right now, which is that the problem for the Republican Party has nothing to do with Iraq, nothing to do with sort of overall unpopularity of Republican ideas, and simply reflects the fact that the party has strayed from small government conservative principles. This is the sort of line that's emerged from the Wall Street Journal editorial page and a lot of sort of affiliated places on the right, and it's the line that drove in a way the Pence and Shadegg candidacies in the House. This idea that we need a return to sort of fiscal austerity and Gingrich-style budget cutting and all of this, and that the current leadership just represents more of the same in terms of pork. Now, it may be that the current leadership represents more of the same in terms of pork and cozying up to lobbyists, and there's no question that the whole sort of lobbyist industrial complex and the hangover from the Abramoff thing played a role in the Republican defeat. But I think the idea that just turning the party over to the Republican Study Committee and Pence and Shadegg and sort of hardline draconian budget cutting is going to restore the GOP to majority status like snapping your fingers, I think is complete folly and totally misjudges the mood of the public and the overall popularity of those kind of conservative ideas.
Do you see any figure in the House, perhaps not necessarily in the leadership, or even in the Senate, now that a whole host of conservative lights, Rick Santorum, for instance, went down in defeat, who can serve as these emergent figures for perhaps a regnant conservatism in the next 2 years or 4 years or however long?
I mean, my money is entirely on, apart from John McCain, who's obviously going to be a face of the party and the front runner in 2008 and so on, I think if there's going to be a Republican comeback in the next 2 years, it's going to be driven by figures from outside the White House. Whether it's a Romney or a Giuliani running for president, or one of the.
Do you mean outside of Washington, or just outside the White House, perhaps in Congress?
I would say probably outside of Washington. Certainly outside, with the exception of McCain, of Congress. I mean, I think all of the prominent Republicans. Santorum went down to defeat. Frist wasn't running, obviously, but he's discredited as the leader of the failed Republican majority and so on. And I mean, this is one of these things with these leadership elections. I think one of the odd things about contemporary politics is that because the national media has become so voracious and covers politics so closely and so on, these jobs that used to exist primarily to twist arms and herd cats and sort of get legislation passed are now becoming spokesman jobs. And that's how you end up with, it's sort of a catch-22, because, the Republicans replaced Trent Lott, who was good at the herding cats aspect of the Senate Majority Leader job, but terrible at the PR face of the party portion. So they kicked him out. They replaced him with Bill Frist, who was supposed to be the smooth sort of face of Bush-era successful mainstream conservatism. But of course, Frist turned out to be a disaster at running the Senate. And so now the Republicans have gone back to Lott, and Lott is going to do a better job at counting votes and getting everybody in line. But you're going to run into the same problem of having him as the face of the party, the same problem that the GOP ran into in the mid '90s when it's Bob Dole and Dick Armey as the people going on TV and talking up the Republican agenda.
Well, speaking of some difficulties with new faces in the party. Difficulties with people who are perhaps an incongruous fit with either the party as a whole or the image the party would like to present. I think one of the more interesting figures for the next Congress is going to be Jim Webb, who just defeated George Allen in that very fiercely contested Senate race in Virginia. I think both of us find Webb to be something of a fascinating figure. And I'd like to hear what you think about that. I mean, the amazing thing to me about Webb, and I've just by virtue of being a national security writer, I've seen it. I think what I might consider a different side of Webb than most in the national media. The man is really best described as, in the classical sense, a conservative. And now that he has this position of, tremendous giant killing authority within the Democratic Party, I think it's going to be a fascinating session.
Yeah, I mean, Webb just wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, of all places, making the case for a sort of robust, full-throated economic populism and, railing against the, corporate CEO salaries and so on. And that was sort of the line that he took along with opposition to the Iraq War during the campaign. And it's something that, but as you say, yeah, he combines that with not so much cultural conservatism on issues like, I'm not on issues like abortion, but a kind of deep-seated cultural conservatism that manifested itself, for instance, in his opposition to women in the military. And
what's interesting to me about, I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
No, go on.
What's interesting to me about Webb is he represents this kind of new model of Democratic military spokesman or Democratic defense expert since probably the Vietnam War. The Democrats, trying to transform their image as the party of, conditional surrender in our own wars and unconditional surrender to our enemies, sort of tried out these different models. And in the 80s, the model they tried out was this sort of wise, technocratic defense expert. Think of Gary Hart. Think of Al Gore. And there was an element of calculation in the sense that the issues of defense were merely a prism through which to refract a new democratic image. Bill Lind, Hart's aide, has talked quite extensively about how he would just basically give Hart a potpourri of positions, and Hart would just find the one that he found more attractive. Gore was more substantive, but there was still that element of defining his own political persona rather than, sitting down and finding what the proper defense posture was for the nation. And I think, interestingly enough, it's only when Al Gore loses the presidency that he's actually come to that. And then in the 90s, and particularly with the last election, after the Atari Democrats sort of run their course and the Cold War ends and the era of Reagan Clintonism begins, the next model the Democrats try out is this sort of Wesley Clark, John Kerry model, and Kerry in particular as the war hero figure for whom biography can substitute for substantive ideas. Kerry is such an interesting figure because his military career ends. He becomes an anti-war figure, and then for 30 years he has nothing to do, more or less, with defense policy. And, strutting back into uniform, metaphorically speaking, to take the Democratic nomination, he presents himself once more as a defense figure. And so now both of those models essentially fail. And now here comes Jim Webb, who has the biography, and more importantly, has his entire career backing up not just issues of defense, quad defense, but in fact issues of how to incorporate, and this was, I think you may remember, Tom Ricks wrote a famous piece for The Atlantic in 1997 about this, how to reincorporate an increasingly distant, culturally speaking, military back with civilian society. And what's so interesting to me about Webb's emergence is the fact that his substantive ideas, with the exception of withdrawal from Iraq, bear, as best as I can tell, no resemblance to any kind of actual democratic position on any defense measure. And so to see him emerge is just going to be fantastic. And I'm curious what you think about all this.
Well, I mean, I think, I've been sort of waiting expectantly for someone on the Republican side to emerge as the spokesman of the sort of what I think Rich Lowry called the "to hell with them hawks," the people who are, as you say, extremely hawkish on defense policy across the board, but opposed to the Iraq War as a war that's destroying our military for foolish objectives and so on. And that hasn't really happened at all among conservatives. But as you say, here comes Webb as a Democrat making what is essentially a conservative case against the Iraq War and taking what has been a traditionally right of center positions on the military. I mean, what I wonder about with Webb is I mean, it's not just this stuff with the military. I mean, he is, traditionally against affirmative action, anti-immigration. I mean, he has a whole host of essentially populist positions that rub up uncomfortably against the current Democratic Party platform and the current Democratic Party coalition. And I mean,
keep in mind that there is a sort of reemergence of populism. You see it on the Democratic side with people like Sherrod Brown, in Montana, Jim Tester, and the governor, Brian Schweitzer. So it's not entirely incongruous.
No, absolutely. I mean, actually, with my co-blogger, Raihan Salam, we wrote a piece about the reemergence of populism in this election. But I think that Webb takes it a step further, where he's even further outside the sort of, not only the Clinton-era Democratic mainstream, but the sort of Dean-era Democratic mainstream as well, than a Brown or a Tester. I mean, he's really in the Perot demographic, I think, which is the place that, I mean, if I were going to not put money, but if there was something I would be interested to see, it would be, in, for instance, a centrist Hillary-style Democrat versus a sort of, technocratic Giuliani-style Republican race, to have a figure like Webb as a third-party candidate.
I think probably what you would see over the next 2 years of debate, particularly about Iraq, would be the use of someone like Webb basically is kind of a rope-a-dope move, where what he'll do is he'll move the argument rather pugilistically out to a certain point beyond which the rest of the party can then say, we'll move back a step, because Webb is I don't want to say extreme, but is rather comfortable pushing the margins of debate out. I mean, this is a man who once advocated an 800-ship Navy at a point where we absolutely didn't need one, in order to get most of what he wanted. And then a figure like Hillary or like Carl Levin, or pick your poison there, can then occupy the ground that Webb the Marine has seized, move back a bit, and then take what'll be a position more to the left than where we've been over the last 2, 4, 6 years, and view that thanks to Webb as the new mainstream center left position.
That's the positive spin for the Democrats. The dangerous thing is if Webb doesn't play well with others, which is, I mean, when he was Secretary of the Navy, when he was a Republican administration apparatchik, that was always his problem. And the Senate is a place where sort of big egos go and potentially clash with other people. I mean, I agree with you. I think that's exactly how the Democrats should try to use him. I'll be very curious to see, how well does Webb get along with the Democratic Senate leadership? How happy is he being a sort of junior figure who gets trotted out to be a spokesman for certain things? I mean, I'll be very curious to see where his ambitions take him, I guess.
Well, right now what we're seeing already is that, Harry Reid and Dick Durbin are embracing him. I mean, he's the giant killer in this election. He knocked off George Allen, who up until a few months ago was a top-tier Republican presidential aspirant. He gave the majority to the Democrats in the Senate. They're definitely showing signs of embracing him. I think you're right. His ego and his pugilism make for a combustible mix in a state Senate. But, Harry Reid, particularly back to your point, Ross, about the inability of Frist to really command the Senate, will be very wise to use Webb in a dominant position, particularly when you look at who the Democratic spokesmen on defense really are. I mean, Carl Levin is not exactly your best foot forward. Imagine an even more disheveled Les Aspin. I like his investigative skills, but beyond that, putting him on a Sunday show is like putting Pigpen at the front of the Charlie Brown comic. And then you've got Jack Reed, and who's he, right? No one has any idea.
And he's from Rhode Island. I mean, yeah.
Right. But I mean, from the sake, like, okay, the guy jumped out of planes, and thank God for that. But beyond that, he's never been able to quite live up to the persona that Harry Reid is foisting on him as the voice of the Democrats on defense issues. And now here comes Webb, who's a very attractive alternative, who doesn't have to reestablish his resume on defense credentials. He'll be someone for whom, if the Republicans ever try something like a Swift boat campaign, will hit back not just hard, but probably in a decisive political blow. I mean, I don't know if you remember, Mac Owens, who's a friend of Webb, wrote an NRO column when Webb announced it. It still looked like he was going to lose to that Virginia, multimillionaire Harris Miller in the Democratic primary. That Owens viewed Webb's entry as something very ominous for a Republican Party that had viewed itself as the political defender of the military, and he saw it quite clearly as being a military and rather old military disgust, almost in the sense of if we had our own, and I don't mean this with any of the comment, in fact I should just abandon this metaphor before it comes out, but if America had a kind of equivalent to the Prussian military caste, the VMI graduates would probably be the closest thing. And I do not mean that in any kind of political sense. Please believe me. I just mean it in the sense of where the military tier fits into a de facto American caste system. A disgust with things like the purple Band-Aids at the Republican convention in 2004 drove Webb into the Democratic Party rather forthrightly. And Owens, who I think is a very smart guy, viewed this as a very ominous turn for the Republican Party.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's hard to see it as anything else. The combination of Webb's views on the military and his ability to speak a language of sort of socially conservative populism, I mean,
that's right.
It could be, again, depending on how you can manage that with the existing Democratic coalition, it's a powerful arrow in the Democratic quiver. But so much of what Webb is able to do with issues of national security and defense, of course, will hinge on what happens in Iraq over the next 2 years. And, of course,
that's right. I mean, this is really going to be the issue where everything plays out. And I've been shocked to see, less so in the political sense because, it always, follows the current, firmly behind public opinion, but more in sort of the chattering classes that you and I belong to. The amount of evasion, obfuscation, almost willful denial about what to do next in Iraq that we've been seeing recently. There's this impulse to say that this deus ex machina of Jim Baker and Lee Hamilton will emerge to save the country. If I can plug my own work, I've got a piece on this for the forthcoming American Prospect. More importantly, I'm disturbed to see that the impulse against withdrawal, I don't believe anymore bears any resemblance to the actual arguments against withdrawal. It strikes me as more a derivative of a vision of American power that's been discredited, I believe, in Iraq, that we're not able to shake anymore, where you see, for instance, just look at the travesty and the train wreck that is this week's New Republic cover package on Iraq, a recognition that every possible conceivable option has failed, and yet there's a reluctance to finally go for the one option available to us, which I believe has a great deal of merit relative to everything else, which is getting out. And I'm curious to know what you believe about that, Ross.
Yes. What do I think about whether we should get out? I mean, my impression of the Baker Commission, of the reason that people are putting all this faith in it, and this may not be true of the editors of the New Republic, who you know better than I do, but I think a lot of people are looking at it as a way to get out, as a way to salvage peace with honor, in the Nixonian phrase, come up with something that gives us a sort of wise man imprimatur for some kind of phased withdrawal or redeployment. There are all these different schemes for redeployment being bandied about, which you know better than I do, but pulling back to various bases, pulling back into Kurdistan, accepting some kind of partition, all of these things. And I think that people are hoping, a lot of people, that Baker plan will sort of clear a path to that. The other thing that's going on, and this is the one thing that hasn't actually been tried, and my sense, probably like yours, is that if it was ever a viable option, it's now too late. But the one thing that hasn't been tried is a larger American troop presence in Iraq. And this is the issue that pundits keep coming back to, both on the right and the hawkish.
Right.
And you did have this moment yesterday, I believe, where John Abizaid actually explicitly made the admission that they had needed more troops in the aftermath of the fall of Baghdad, which is something that the generals had been loath to say thus far. But tell me, because you're following this more closely than I am, is there talk now about adding 20,000 more troops? Is that what I read today, or
supposedly there's talk of moving 20,000 troops from elsewhere in Iraq to reinforce Baghdad. The question that anyone has to go to when they say, it's time for more troops is
where
us and whose army? I mean, it's now a question. Do you want to take the 18,000 or so troops that we have in Afghanistan and move them to Iraq? Do you want to take the 2nd Infantry Division entirely out of Korea and move it into Iraq? Where are these mystical troops? I mean, it's a mantra to cover an impulse more than it is an actual option. I mean, you see the editorial in this week's Weekly Standard just says something to the tune of, critics say that there are not American forces to be added. This is not true. There are more troops. And then he moves on. Crystal and Kagan do.
Right.
To which you just left sort of, if you're like me, Ross, sputtering, kicking the dog, trying to figure out what other books you have handy that you can throw around, paging through the yellow pages, trying to find out where these people live so you can, go to their house and, do something unspeakable. It's this amazing, amazing evasion and almost a puerile impulse. What also happened at the Abizaid hearing you referred to is that McCain not just pressed Abizaid on retroactively whether we needed more troops as kind of academic question, but whether it's desirable to add troops now, and Abizaid resisted that rather strongly. Mm-hmm. It's not a realistic option. Like most options, particularly most options that I think, in a kind of abstract sense, we would like to see occur in Iraq. Disarm the militias. Heal sectarian divides. Well, lovely, but this is way, way too late for that. We're several hours past midnight in Iraq, and as a result of, I'm going to go back in about 3 weeks if the army ultimately approves my latest MBED request. And they rejected my last one, so I'm not exactly sure that this is going to happen. But if I go back, I look forward to seeing this directly from the eyes of American soldiers and Marines about what it's like now, just as a question for your humanity, to be told as a very valiant, courageous American soldier or Marine that you have this mission, but the mission can't possibly succeed. What toll does that take on you? I'm curious to know the answer.
So what, when people talk about the case for withdrawal, though, so what does withdrawal mean? Let's say you were put in charge of withdrawing U.S. forces from Iraq. How would you go about doing that?
Well, in terms of the timetable for withdrawal, first what I would need to do is extract some kind of public acknowledgement from the Iraqi government or factions surrounding it that we will together come up with the modalities for withdrawal. And whether that means 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, is less important, I think, than establishing that American policy is no longer to stay but to leave. And that'll mean, ultimately, finding where else in the region to base, a residual force, in the sense that, after the Gulf War ended, all of a sudden we had between half and a full division, at absolute most, usually around 5,000 soldiers, in Saudi Arabia. And so, we'll have the
that didn't work out so well.
Well, in what sense didn't it work out? I mean, it accomplished its objective for containing Saddam Hussein, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but there were some side effects in terms of its effect on Muslim public opinion, I think, that were
certainly
less than ideal.
It's less than ideal, but unless you're prepared to say, and I'm not, that we have to just absolutely get out of the Middle East. And by get out, I mean, let's be clear about what we mean. We don't just mean removing our military presence, and this is get out in the sense of what perhaps it might take to mollify someone like bin Laden, if we take seriously that should be our objective. It would also mean to cut off funding for all of our proxies, the Saudis, the Egyptians, and the Israelis, and absolutely get rid of, and the Gulf states as well, and get rid of our, the Fifth Fleet in Qatar, in the Persian Gulf. It would really mean, all or nothing there. And I don't think that's something that the first order is desirable from the perspective of either, our security primarily, then our allies' security secondarily, and then finally regional security. And secondly, it's not something that would be acceptable either to the region's rulers and to the American public and political spectrum. So if you just look at it in the sense that, getting out of Iraq does not mean getting out of the region, then we've got, an actual framework for what to do next. If you were to give me my druthers, if I were Secretary of Defense and Dick Cheney was my sugar daddy, what I would do is I would pull back to Al-Udeid. I would have an air raid capability when necessary. And we're talking, large fixed-wing aircrafts as well as helicopters. I would have probably elements from the 82nd and the 101st Airborne ready if necessary to move in, some special forces elements. And as well, we keep the Fifth Fleet in Qatar, so we have not just sailors, we'll have naval aviators, and we'll have Marines. And in whatever size we'll need, if absolutely necessary. And this is the trouble for people like me who believe that withdrawal is the only desirable outcome at this point. There may be periods where we would have to put discrete forces back into Iraq, to be absolutely clear about this and not to be euphemistic, to break a lot of stuff and kill a lot of people. Now, I'm of the opinion that what may emerge as, in the common parlance, safe havens for al-Qaeda isn't really going to be something that's going to be focused on the United States, because people use safe haven in the sense of a safe haven for ultimate exfiltration back to America. Well, think about this for a second. When we get out, the only thing that binds, and I can talk about this in more detail if you're interested, or if our viewers are interested, the only thing that binds al-Qaeda and the Sunni Arabs together, the Sunni Arabs have shown themselves rather, willing to kill al-Qaeda when necessary, because, you wouldn't want a 20-year-old Yemeni to tell you what to do either in terms of your religious practice. Binding us together is the United States. And now with the Shiite threat, what's going to be more likely, I think, after we get out, is that al-Qaeda and the Sunni Iraqis are going to be bound together by al-Qaeda's willingness to assist them in slaughtering Shiite Iraqis, rather than getting on a plane to San Francisco. So I think that's going to be less of a concern, a first-order concern, for U.S. national security in terms of, dear Lord, al-Qaeda has Anbar province, aren't they going to come to kill us?
Okay, but leaving aside the al-Qaeda phenomenon, what happens if and when, so much of the violence now isn't related directly to al-Qaeda or to al-Qaeda in Iraq or to the, sort of insurgent attacks on the U.S. government. It's right. Sectarian violence, and it's sort of bubbling along at a low but horrible level. What happens when we've got the 101st Airborne there, we've got, enough troops to intervene at a moment's notice, and you have, stuff like what followed partition in India happening in northern and southern Iraq, and you have the massive humanitarian crisis, say, that people anticipated when the war first broke out. My fear with withdrawal is that all this means is that we're going to leave, and then,
and we're going to come back.
Then we're going to have to come back, because we're the only force that can go back, and this sort of global outcry is going to be huge, and people. A lot of what happened. You had a similar thing happen in Vietnam, except that we didn't go back in when North Vietnam went into the South. But I feel like that was a different moment in world history. It was a moment when these sort of atrocities could be carried out on a large scale without CNN covering them around the clock and so on. And in the same way that, like, CNN forced the U.S. into Somalia in the early 90s, I think that if we pull out and things go even worse than they are now, we'll be forced back in over and over again.
Well, my unrealistic hope is that we would actually have in this country a debate over what our posture toward Iraq ought to be. Do we actually have, in a clear declarative sense, or even just in the sense of what we believe we ought to do, the belief that Iraq's humanitarian problems are our own because of the Colin Powell pottery barn rule?
Right.
Or do we believe, and I think this is the correct issue, at this point, Iraq's sectarian factions believe they have more to gain, it's more in their interest to go to war than to negotiate. I think this is the sort of situation that where war is the only foreseeable outcome. And I have no idea how that'll go. I imagine that it'll be like Lebanon, except worse. The only thing I can imagine that would be worse would be us getting caught in the middle of it. And if this means, I'll be very clear here, and I'll take the hit on being cold-blooded. I've been to, I drove at one point into Kirkuk unembayed in January, which was a very stupid thing to do. And I had to turn around very quickly. If there's a war over those oil fields, a whole lot of people are going to die. But what I imagine will occur, because the Kurdish position, I mean, if you actually drive on the road from Erbil to Kirkuk, you see how overwhelmingly well fortified the Kurds have established that position. There will be a massive surge of Kurdish forces that can take and hold those oil fields, which are in the north of the city, particularly. The Kurds will take it, and then there'll be acts of terrorism by Sunni Arabs, but the Sunnis are going to have to contend with what the Shiites want. I imagine we're going to have a situation not entirely qualitatively different than what we have now. I think the actual conflagrations will be a lot bloodier, but there'll be this sort of discrete activity rather than this ideational movement of force on force or mass on mass in these particular cities. You'll have 3 days worth of incredibly intense and bloody fighting, like we saw in Balad recently, and then a movement of populace out into homogeneous sectarian areas, with the exception of Baghdad, probably the exception of Mosul. And then there'll be a bit of quiet while the factions sort of stagger to figure out what in the world they're going to do next. But, I mean, one of the things that should probably guide us is the idea that, one of the most painful things about the Iraq War is there's never this moment of decision. Everything grinds on in this, slow and steady descent into oblivion and chaos and horror. And now I sound like a Cradle of Filth song. But there's no decisive event whereby you can say, except in retrospect, something massively changed. And I believe that'll be the case after we leave as well.
Yeah, no, I think that that's probably true in the sense that the day after we leave won't be, the moment when things go from 0 to 60 in 10 seconds or something.
Right.
It's just it's not just what goes on in Iraq. It's the presence of Turkey next door and its problems with the Kurds. It's the presence of Iran next door and its issues with the Shiites and the Sunnis and so on. Anyway, I'm not offering an alternative plan here by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm a complete agnostic on this issue. I'm someone who goes back and forth, and my sort of determining, I tend to be in the camp that we need to stay because things get so much worse once we leave. But then every time I pick up the New York Times and read a story about an American, an individual American soldier getting killed, and I can't help it. I do have that John Kerry, how do you ask somebody to be the last man to die for a mistake feeling. And George Will wrote a column about soldiers dying in Iraq, and he ended it with the question, for what? And that's, on alternate days, that's how I feel. It seems to me that, we could very well be staggering towards a wider and more disastrous regional war no matter what we do. But I can certainly see a lot of ways in which our pulling out, but having these sort of mobile forces there, trying to decide whether to intervene or not on a case-by-case basis, inflames things rather than improves them. But
sure. I mean, let me be clear about something that I realize now I wasn't clear about. The only situation in which I would want this sort of ever-ready force to re-intervene in Iraq is if we have reason to believe, or reason to suspect even, that whatever safe haven emerges for al-Qaeda
right.
isn't focused on the Shiites and is focused on exfiltration either to our friends in the region, in Europe, or us. Then we go back and then we start killing people. And that I think is acceptable. I just don't think that's. I just don't think that's. I mean, I think that that's a good policy in the abstract. Yes.
Realistically, I see various things forcing us back in over and over again for reasons that have nothing. And yeah, I agree. It would be nice if we could have some kind of national debate and sort of establish a stance towards post-occupation Iraq. I just think, and maybe the 2008 presidential election will provide that debate or something. I just see it's going to be something where policymakers are making seat-of-the-pants decisions, and we're going to go back in sometimes, and we're not going to go back in sometimes. But
I don't think you're wrong, Ross. I think that overwhelmingly there will be this impulse that, oh my God, awful things are occurring. We're right on the outskirts of it. And we basically created the conditions for this to occur by the fact of our withdrawal and the fact of our intervention in the first place. I mean, do you ever see Three Kings, that Marky Mark and Ice Cube movie?
Yeah, no, I watched it. I was an Iraq War hawk who became gradually more skeptical as the invasion approached, and I watched that movie the day we went into Iraq to make myself feel better about the invasion. Because it was sort of like, oh, we screwed it up last time, but we're going to go back and make things right. Which obviously didn't turn out quite that way, did it?
Well, I think this is something that I think the only way the disaster will truly be compounded is if we don't ask ourselves as a country how it could be that this mania overtook us, otherwise sensible people, to believe in this overwhelmingly unfettered and benign understanding of American power that almost approaches a divine omnipotence and absolute unrestrained implementation of intentionality. And unless we ask ourselves that, we're going to, I believe, very tragically, stumble into the next Iraq and the next Iraq and the next Iraq.
Well, maybe what we need is to put George W. Bush on trial for war crimes at the Hague. What do you think about that?
Well,
I had a debate back and forth with your roommate Matt Iglesias about the International Criminal Court, and Matt was defending the position against some of the commenters on his blog that no, it would be a bad idea to put members of the administration on trial for war crimes because it would, the U.S. public wouldn't support it. But his underlying theory, I think, was that you should have an international criminal court that could put George W. Bush or Donald Rumsfeld on trial, and in an ideal world, you would. And I think, so what do you think about that possibility?
Well, there are two questions here. One is it a wise decision to do that? And second, is there a justification to do that? Not being a lawyer, but being at least, somewhat, at least journalistically familiar.
You're a pundit. You don't need to be a lawyer.
Yeah, I think you can put a case together that Rumsfeld and Cheney and Bush are war criminals. And you could put them on trial with the ICC if we were a part of it. As to the question of its wisdom, it's probably not very wise. But what I think is wise is something that speaks to what you said, Ross, in your response to Matt, which is, you've got these strange bedfellows of, Andy Basovich and Ross Douthat and Matt Iglesias. Basically anyone who doesn't subscribe to the neoconservative imperialist America Unrestrained project that breaks down over issues like the ICC. But you do have this sense, perhaps it's only on the level of cliche, that the next administration will have to do something to orient itself back within an international framework. And I would submit to you that we can't just say we're going to play nice with everyone else now. We've got to take some concrete action to show people that we will, because otherwise, any administration after Bush, be it a Republican administration that you'll vote for, or a Democratic administration that I'll vote for, will have things that I think you and I will be able to say we ought to do on the world stage that may be somewhat controversial beyond, some kind of, trade deal or something like that. And the rest of the world ain't going to buy it, unless we show that we're committed in some non-abstract, very concrete way to restrain our own power within the traditional framework of, the Rooseveltian international order that I think you and I, perhaps I'm speaking for you and I shouldn't, but certainly that I believe is basically the correct answer to the fundamental question of what sort of international order shall we have. So
I guess this is a play. I like the Rooseveltian international order, but I think that I like it for different reasons than you do. I like it because I think it's an example of the U.S. constructing an international order that both fosters stability, which is something that I want to see, and furthers U.S. national interests, and is amenable to overall, essentially, control by the U.S.
Well, except for that last part, Ross, we actually do like it for the same reasons.
I'm sorry?
Well, except for that last part about, American hegemony, we do like it for the same reasons. I would just...
Well, American hegemony it's such a loaded term, and I don't think that, the U.S. needs to design the international order so that the U.S. can control all events, in East Timor or Sri Lanka or wherever, or decide who rises and who falls in, southeastern Africa. I just think if there's going to be sort of these multilateral bodies, the U.S.'s goal should be to maximize its influence in them. And that doesn't mean... And
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. The caveat I would add for that is that I have, this perhaps wishy-washy in your view, conception that ultimately the purpose of the international order ought not to be merely the preservation or the relative balance of stability, but also a promotion of human rights. And so that would be, I guess, the caveat that I would hope the Rooseveltian international order can finally fulfill, as this was, a dream of St. Eleanor.
Ah, well, St. Eleanor. Well, yeah, there's another place where you and I are going to disagree a little bit. But nobody's against human rights except maybe as philosophical constructs. But I think the question... if you look at something like the International Criminal Court, and this was what I said in my argument with Matt, was that you don't want to set up bodies that are theoretically dedicated to human rights and then either can't or shouldn't enforce the law. This is my problem with the whole concept of international law, is that as it's not law in the sense that domestic law is, because there are lots and lots of situations in which you don't want to enforce international law for strictly prudential reasons. Just to take it for instance right now, if it were possible for the International Criminal Court to have a strike force of UN Marines who could helicopter their way into Moscow and arrest Vladimir Putin and take him to the Netherlands and Belgium and put him on trial and convict him and sentence him to lifetime in prison in a cushy European prison, that would meet the demands of justice and human rights. Clearly, Vladimir Putin is a flagrant violator of human rights all over the place, and just the Chechen situation alone is enough to meet the criteria that any system of international law would set up for war crimes. That said, you don't want to do that because it would be an epic disaster for global stability. And to me, it seems like if you ever reach a point where you can do things like that and they aren't epic disasters for global stability, the world will be so at peace that you won't need this kind of multilateral, international criminal court to begin with.
Well, perhaps I'm missing your point somewhat, but could it not be at least theoretically conceivable to attach a caveat to this idea whereby it's a long-established canon of diplomatic practice that sitting administrations have a certain amount of immunity, so that when Putin is out of power, and I guess that he would send in the UN Marines to arrest him, detain him, and then set him up for his trial. So you would have hopefully you would believe a deterrent aspect to whatever it is he might prosecute. Of course, I can easily see the objection that then it would just create an incentive for Putin to just never leave power.
Well, there's that, and there's also the fact that in most situations, I mean, this has happened. It happened with Milosevic. But the reason that was able to happen was because he lost all domestic support and was essentially turned over by his own people. And I think in those scenarios, the system works. It's just pretty hard for me to imagine a scenario, just to continue with the Putin example, in which Putin steps down from power. 5 years later, while he's traveling in Germany, he gets arrested and put on trial, and the Russian people and present Russian government are not, inflamed about this. And this is what bothered me, for instance, about, the Pinochet trial and the arrest in Spain, I think it was, and all of that. Not that Augusto Pinochet didn't commit the crimes of which he is accused, but the fact that Pinochet was a model for a dictator leaving power peacefully, and it's the kind of model that you want to encourage, and you don't then want to say...
Let's not sugarcoat the idea that Pinochet... I mean, in the strict sense, he left power peacefully. He left, however, on terms that I think you would agree overwhelmingly favored his I don't know what the right way of putting this is.
Oh yeah, no. He was a senator for life, and his party was still in power, and there were all sorts of perks and immunities from prosecution. No, I agree, but given the way that dictatorships have ended in many other countries, and given the relative peace and domestic harmony that Chile has enjoyed since then, I mean, I think that the way he left power was, not the best of all possible worlds, but certainly better than an awful lot of the alternatives.
Right.
I mean, and I guess... No, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I think that the Saddam trial, and this should probably be the last thing that I'll say about this, because clearly you've thought about this in much more detail than I have. The Saddam trial offers what would seem to be the alternative juridical approach, which is a sort of near pornographic parody of international law, which is to say, essentially, what doesn't, it wasn't exactly a kangaroo court, but the problems it was trying to solve, that the United States, tried to solve, is basically, you don't give any legitimacy to this model that might come back to bite you in the ass, which is to say this international criminal model. What you do is you set up a panel basically under incredibly ill-defined Iraqi law with as minimal international input as possible, and somehow the U.S. believes it's immune from that construct because we're the nice big brothers to the Iraqis, and the trial is a travesty. I have no quarrel with the outcome of the Saddam trial, but for God's sake, we'll never have closure to the Anfal genocide. We'll never have closure to the 1991 Shiite massacre. We got him, sentenced to hang for Dujail, which I don't believe many people outside of Iraq had ever heard of before all of a sudden the trial emerged with that being the first list of charges. And now you have a model that basically was created, so we wouldn't allow Saddam a platform to pontificate and inveigh against the new order that's replaced him. Well, he did it anyway. And, I think none dare call it injustice in this case. And it's a real shame, and to me it shows that there really is only one other viable model, and I'm sorry to say the present administration of the United States has turned its back on it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say about that I agree that the Saddam trial has been something of a debacle, but I think that many of the reasons that it was a debacle were the same reasons that the Iraq occupation in general was a debacle. I mean, judges getting assassinated and the sort of sectarian divide plaguing the trial the way it plagues the country. I mean, I think that you can imagine all sorts of terrible things that would have followed from taking Saddam and putting him on trial in front of an international court that have nothing to do with. I mean, it would have done damage to the U.S., clearly, in ways that the present administration didn't want it to. But I can certainly see the reasoning behind putting Saddam on trial in his own country under the authority of his own national government. And I think that, the failures of the Saddam trial aside, overall, that's, it's worked in other places. It's worked in places like Rwanda and South Africa and so on, having a new regime that handles the crimes of the old. But,
well, Rwanda was an international tribunal.
That's true. Well,
are you talking about the Gacaca courts?
I'm sorry?
Are you talking about the Gacaca courts in Rwanda?
I can't. I'm losing you there for a second, Spencer.
Sorry.
No. You probably know more. You probably know more about Rwanda than I do, actually. So I should just defer to you on that. Anyway.
Okay. Well. Moving on. I mean, I called the Saddam trial near pornographic, but now let's talk about actual pornography. I noticed you were interested in something I had up on my blog about a college friend of mine, Joanna, who now goes by Joanna Angel, who's an incredibly successful pornographic entrepreneur and porn empress, in addition to being one of the hot new porn stars out there, particularly in sort of punk rock, heavily tattooed pornography. She's also quite a successful businesswoman. She's built something really amazing for herself. And she happens also to be Jewish. And a Jewish website that apparently I'm going to be blogging for next week wrote a story about interviewing Joanna's mother. And the whole thing was just so sordid because I also happen to know Joanna's mother. And Juicy seemed to revel in Joanna's mother's pain about her daughter's chosen profession.
Yeah, no, it was fascinating. I went and read the interview, and I agree that the sort of they did it as first an interview with her mother and then an interview with her, and it was sort of it was as a piece of journalism, it was sort of shockingly crass, I guess would be the word. But I was also interested in. I read the interview with the mother, and I thought, Juicy is shockingly crass. On the other hand, I feel incredibly sorry for this woman who has to know that, her daughter is making a living as a porn star, porn empress, and so on. And, so much of this issue just comes down to what you think about porn, and, is it all in good fun, and particularly if it's run by a woman and female empowering, there's nothing wrong with it, and so on. But clearly her mother thinks that there's something wrong with it. And I thought your reaction, you made a comment on your blog that was something to the effect of, and forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, that, any discussion of Joanna has to address the fact that, she's not just a porn star, she's an incredibly successful businesswoman. And I thought that was sort of an odd thing to say, because, if you think that porn is bad, and if you think it's bad that your daughter is involved in porn, it doesn't seem to me to make much difference whether she's making a lot of money at it or a little bit.
Right, I would agree with that. It is certainly from the value perspective that you would bring to it, rather irrelevant and almost comically irrelevant what I wrote. The trouble is that I don't think that ends the argument. We have to at this point, if we're really deep in the weeds of this incredibly crass and I believe mean-spirited decision to force Joanna's mother to comment on what she's doing, we have to address the question of whether Joanna's mother is correct in how she feels. And I don't believe that she is. I don't imagine that I could go about persuading her, but I would add that what Joanna does, shouldn't be sugarcoated. It's pornography. But I will confess to you something, Ross.
Yes.
Joanna has sent me a whole lot of pornography. It's in this house right now.
How close is it to you at the moment? Like physically, how close?
Right now, 3 floors up.
Oh, okay. So you couldn't hold up a DVD cover for the camera.
I don't think that would be possible on a family website. But what I will say is that there is something good here. One of the reasons that she sent me all this stuff was because I was sending. I wanted to send a care package including pornography, to a very old friend of mine who's now leading a platoon in Iraq. So Joanna did her patriotic duty, and I'm told that the troops are very appreciative of that. But what I mean to say about this is we shouldn't sugarcoat what it is she does, nor should we be interested in it. But it just by pointing out that you see these films of horror of horrors, people having sex. You should not allow yourself to believe that there's something inherently filthy or degrading about it. And it's always struck me as interesting to see, forgive me because I mean no offense here, Ross, those on the right inveigh against pornography because of this idea that it degrades women, where I don't really see much emphasis in other spheres about behavior or activities that degrade women coming from those same mouthpieces.
I guess it depends on what behaviors you think degrade women. I think that it's certainly possible to imagine pornography that doesn't particularly degrade women, and I will confess something.
You don't even have to imagine it, my friends. You can go to www.burningangel.com.
No, I was going to confess to you that I'd already been there, and purely for sociological reasons, of course, after your post.
Of course.
And it's. I would say this. I would say that 90% of the mainstream pornography that you see in the United States of America is particularly degrading to women. I think that pornography degrades both participants in it, but it's pretty clear that, in mainstream porn, the woman is more degraded than the man. Now, that said,
Ross, can I butt in here for a second?
Yes.
I wanted to ask you to tease that out. Do you believe it's degrading to women, or do you believe it's degrading to Ross Douthat's idea of a woman's dignity?
I think that, there are 2 points, and there's one on which I think we're just going to disagree and shouldn't really argue, but that I think filming yourself having sex for the consumption of other people is degrading to something that I would call human dignity in general. Now, bracketing that, the specific way that pornography is filmed, and I don't know if we want to go into details, this is probably a family website, but is particularly degrading to women in the sense that it treats them, I actually really, I think you know what I mean, Spencer. I think I don't have to sort of specifically, but the way the films are videoed are, they're, sort of, I would describe a lot of them that's, mainstream stuff as sort of borderline rape and Lolita fantasies in which, the women in particular exist just to sort of service the men.
Not only would I not disagree with that, Ross, I'll go even further toward your position. I was watching one of Joanna's films, again purely for sociological purposes, at 3 in the morning, and I was my own bourgeois sensibilities were shocked to see this one scene, and if you'll forgive me, gentle viewer, you might want to fast forward past this section, in which one of Joanna's actresses is performing oral sex on her male counterpart, and the man starts slapping his penis against her mouth. Now, I found that really hard to take. That seemed to me, and I don't know how I would answer the question I posed to you, Ross, but that was certainly degrading to my own view of female dignity. Mm-hmm. And we can go back and forth in some arguments about feminism, about whether this woman consenting to appear in this film is really therefore not licensed to complain about any activity she is then asked to partake in. I don't believe that's really correct. But I have to say, it really did disturb me to see that even in Joanna's supposedly women-empowering films, there was this scene where some woman is getting, her face actually slapped, and it doesn't look very enjoyable by a man's erection.
Well, I guess I would say that you're sort of proving what would be my theory, which is that all pornography sort of tends in certain directions by its nature. In the larger frame, I think it does. It's such a worldview divide, whether you think porn is inherently bad, or whether you think it's only bad for secondary reasons having to do with the degradation of women. I think conservatives pick up on the sort of degradation of women argument. While I happen to think it's true, they pick up on it as a way to appeal to people who may not think that porn is inherently bad as well. But I mean, and it's the same debate that we have over prostitution. Is there something inherently wrong with the commodification of intimate life, and particularly sexuality? And it's one of those things where to argue it, you get involved very quickly in airy sort of not necessarily natural law, but sort of philosophical abstractions. So maybe since we're running past the hour mark, we should leave the great porn debate for another time. I guess I just
well, I hope, Ross, that you're serious about leaving it for another time, because I have about 6 or 7 movies I'd like to show you.
Well, I think that the next, basically, and maybe we can set this up for our next Blogging Heads, we can have a third screen in between us that's showing a pornographic movie, and you and I can sort of provide running commentary on it, sort of Mystery Science Theater 3000 style.
Oh, that would be great.
I'll have to go to confession afterwards, but I assume that's okay, and maybe Blogging Heads can pay for a cab over to the to the St. Matthew's Cathedral or something. But
I as well will have to go into a dark and confined area.
All right, fair enough. Well, Spencer, it was great chatting with you, and hopefully we can
Same
do it
here,
again
Ross.
soon.
Absolutely. Take care.
Take care.